Hey, I'm Jesse. Let's have our 750th devotion with JCM. All right, I've written lots of others. They're out there in those books and things like that, and there's more in the curriculum, but this feels a little bit worthy of observation here. If you've been with us for all 750 of these devotions for the last 2.5 years, I just want to thank you so much, all right, for being a part of it. Let's look at Judges chapter 1, beginning in verse 27. At that time, Manasseh failed to take possession of Beth Shean and Tanach and their surrounding villages, or the residents of Dor, Eblim, and Megiddo and their surrounding villages. The Canaanites were determined to stay in this land. Okay, we're gonna come back to that. When Israel became stronger, they made the Canaanites serve as forced labor, but never drove them out completely. God never prescribed this. They now had committed the very sins of chattel slavery from whence their ancestors just a generation ago had been miraculously delivered by the plagues. And now, rather than obeying God and driving these people out, they've now enslaved them, used them for forced labor. And I guess it's just easier that way. But also, those cultures are going to influence them, especially the tribe of Dan. Just watch. At that time, Ephraim failed to drive out the Canaanites who were living in Gezer. So the Canaanites have lived among them in Gezer. Right, there it is again. They're just rather than driving out, they're just cohabitating. Zebulun failed to drive out the residents of Kitron or the residents of Nahalal, so the Canaanites lived among them and served as forced labor. Asher, not my son, the tribe of Asher. This is not Asher, my son Asher's fault. Asher failed to drive out the residents of Akko or of Sidon, Ahlab, Achzib, Helba, Aphig, or Rahab. The Asherites lived among the Canaanites who were living in the land because they failed to drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the residents of Beth Shemesh or the residents of Beth Anath. They lived among the Canaanites who were living in the land, but the residents of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath served as their forced labor. This was just kind of what they all resorted to. The Amorites forced the Danites into the hill country and did not allow them to go down into the valley. Remember, at this point, the Amorites are the bad guys. The Danites, this is the tribe of Dan. These are the people of God. They would later the Danites would just be relegated away. Rather than taking the land, they would just get kicked out of their land, and they would later resort to idolatry. The Amorites were determined to stay in Har Heres, Aijalon, and Shalbim. When the house of Joseph got the upper hand, the Amorites were made to serve as forced labor. So even when the house of Joseph, the Ephraimites, even when they did gain power, they still just kind of settled. Right? They just cohabitated, and they just used the Canaanites for forced labor instead, going right back to the very sins of chattel slavery that Egypt had committed upon them. The territory of the Amorites extended from the Scorpion's Ascent, that is from Selah upward. And man, it all comes down to this, right? The Canaanites were determined to stay in this land. And the problem with each of these tribes, right, from Manasseh and Zebulun, and Asher and Naphtali and Dan, is that they were less determined to do what God had called them to do than the pagans were determined to continue on in their pagan practices in God's chosen land. Christian, be more determined to do the will of God, be more determined to advance the gospel and answer the Great Commission right here where you've evidently been called. Be more determined to do God's will than the enemy is determined to bring about further depravity. May the people of God be more determined than the enemies of God, because the people of God actually have a righteous calling.